Hello, Drukhari fans, and welcome back to part 5 of the Return of the Archon series. It is I, Tom, the very lowest of men of 6++. I'm back again to talk all things stabby, all things evil, and run you through this latest event report in my return to the Dark Elder, return to the Drukhari recent run of events. So this is part 5. We've been going a little while now. Nicely established formula. Thanks so much to everyone who's been commenting. Please do hit like and subscribe and comment. Remember that obviously you can support 6++ on the channel by becoming a YouTube member as well. What I'm going to be talking about today is an event I went to just this weekend gone at Hellstorm up near Nottingham. The Hellstorm All-Stars, which is a fantastic event, one of my favourites. Actually, the first GT I ever went to was a Hellstorm, so it holds a very special place in my heart. And I took the Dark Eldar back up there for a run of 5 really good games, really interesting games, and learned a lot more in my continued pursuit of Drukhari knowledge. So I'm here to share that with you, go through the matchups, go through what I found, go through what I learned. Tried a slightly different list this time as well, so I've got a few reflections on this kind of melee versus shooting balance as well for you all. So, launching straight into the event expectations, Hellstorm has quite a unique meta in as much as it has several different types of terrain. There are 5 different boards across the event, and you never know exactly which one you will land on when paired into your matches at each round. So you've got player place, which is also just has a fixed layout for those that don't want to do player place, which I believe is most people's choice. You can play it on a sort of WTC style, on a Game at EU type style, a GW board. You can also play on UKTC. So there's a whole mix of different things in play, which means that exactly what army you hit and what terrain you hit them on has a big impact on the game. I'm a huge fan of this. I think generalship and adapting to circumstances should be a part of what we do in 40k. I don't like everything being solved and pre-planned, and I think that kind of ability to adapt to unexpected challenges is something I really enjoy in the game, and it's one of the things I love about Hellstorm. Hellstorm is near the kind of sort of Nottingham area, and it gets a lot of the very best players from the Midlands and the North coming down very regularly, and a lot of sort of Team England people and people in and around that circuit as well. So it's a very strong player base. Whenever I've gone to Hellstorm, I've played incredibly high standards of opponents, which means that my actual results haven't tended to be as good, but the experience and the learning has been excellent. So I was very up for that with the Drukhari, and I think my anticipation going in was that a positive win rate was very possible. Anything beyond that was going to depend on who I played and when I played them. So missions, matchups, and players very important in determining outcomes here. Looking at the rosters going in, there was a lot of Guard and a lot of Necrons, neither of which are very nice for Drukhari. So I think to get deep in the event, I was going to have to duck and weave these as far as I possibly could. One thing I was very keen for in this was, other than playing really good players and getting useful feedback and learning from those games, was to start stress testing Drukhari for the International Teams Tournament. I love the Drukhari and they're my favourite army to play, so if I think there is a sort of logical and viable place for them in a 5 for our ITT team that are going, which I've kind of been drafted back into after we had a drop, I think my preference would always be to take the Drukhari. So I want to keep checking that I can play them consistently, keep checking that I can project and understand score well with them, and get more knowledge on the matchups. And then maybe, just maybe, a data slate will put them in an even better spot than they were before. I'm trying a new list here as well, which I will get into in a moment. I'd found in the last few events that my very Incubi heavy build, whilst enormous fun, packing an incredible go turn, maybe needed a little bit more customization so that I could play a slightly wider range of matchups and a slightly wider range of styles. So we'll think about that now, and then we will get into the games. So here's Combined Arms Sky Splinter. There are a lot of variants on this out there in the world at the moment, so you'll see plenty of lists that run this way. But there are a couple of things in here which I think coming out of the event I would do differently now. I went with Lilith, double Archon, one with the Nightmare Shroud, and a Beastmaster for my characters. I was trying only 4 characters because I wanted to just see how trimming down characters in favour of more units worked, and I also wanted to deny the possibility of an opponent just taking Assassinate for the full 20 against me in some of the games. Supporting them, I had 10 Witches and 2 squads this time of 10 Cabalites. I've been really enjoying Cabalites sort of pseudo fire and fading out of the venom round walls to shoot, get that extra reach, punish the opponent, and I was curious to see whether 2 squads would give me a little bit more passive shooting to stand off the opponent and shoot without losing assets in the early game. As a result, the Incubi make way. I've gone for 5 and a 10 brick of Incubi here, so I've still got my killer Raider brick and then 1 smaller melee squad that typically was a rapid ingress threat on games where I could get away with that. Still going with 2x5 mandrakes for scoring, and then I've added in 2x5 racks here. 2 squads of Lance Scourge, and a Haywire Scourge squad. The racks, I think, is something that, Rob and I and my 6++ Drukhari teammate have tested plenty now, and I mean, they really help you in certain matchups where pain tokens are hard to come by. Being able to throw away a couple of rack squads and rack up those early pain tokens from their deaths is very useful. And they're also great for primary denial and forcing the opponent to start doing things, because you can just keep chucking OC onto points for the early rounds of the game, which puts them under pressure for their primary to come and get you. Still got the humble Kronos doing his thing, waving his tentacly arms, hugging people at inopportune moments to slow them down, but most importantly, giving me 4-up generation on pain tokens. Now, the Kronos has started actually making 4-ups for me lately, so I am delighted. For my first few games of the Kronos, he just wasn't refunding my tokens. I was starting to get annoyed with him. Definitely seeing the value now that he actually, more often than not, does manage to get me some tokens back early game. I've then got in the vehicle department a Ravager with triple Lances, a Raider, and 4 Venoms. So the 4 Venoms, I've moved away from 2 Raiders. I have been running 2 with Lilith and the 10 Incubi. What I've found is maneuvering 2 Raiders around, especially UKTC terrain, is very difficult. I've been struggling to get them into the game and get them up the board. I think because you can only use the stratagem support on a single Raider, in terms of using Wraithlight Retreat to get back in a transport, it typically means that if you want to have a big turn and commit Witches and Incubi, you're going to have to leave one of those units on the board, and it slightly minimizes your play with those, which I wasn't enjoying. I don't like feeling forced into that play. There can be moments that make sense. I don't like feeling like I have no choice if I want to commit both squads. So by taking more Venoms, you've got more of that free end of fight phase return to transport action, which I've been enjoying in practice and I felt worked well here. And indeed, Raiders in general are definitely one of the units which I have an increasing question mark around. I know Scary over in Canada runs pure Venoms and puts a lot of stock in that, and I can definitely see the appeal in this. But Raiders obviously become essential if you want to run the larger 10 bricks, things like the 10 Incubi, full squad of Witches, or maybe a Court of the Archon with Kabalites involved. Raiders really help with that. So that was the list. I was a little apprehensive. I definitely have slightly less of a go moment in this list. It doesn't have quite the same offensive juice, but what it is more flexible, because I've got 2 leftover 5-mans from the extra Kabalite squad and the Witch squad being split, which gives me even more walk-on MSU for scoring, for screening, for flipping points with additional OC later in the game. And I think that kind of high scoring ceiling is something Drukhari should always be trying to maximize. So this was me trying to be a little bit less brutal, a little bit less heavy-handed, and a little bit more subtle and sneaky, in the line with other Archons like our wonderful Rob Kimpton, who's a master of this style of play. So for round 1, I was paired into Deathguard. Now, I have played Deathguard multiple times since this index has come out. I haven't yet lost to it. I've had a bit of luck here and there, but I've found Deathguard manageable, but it is a horrible game because you've got Plague Burst Crawlers shelling you. You have a big brick of Plague Marines with a Foul Blight spawn for fight first, which you cannot attack straight up without losing. Death Shroud have incredible weapons for punching us, are very good on the counter-attack, and then Bloat Drones kind of force your engagement, just that obnoxious sort of kind of profile that requires you to step out and deal with them. And also a lot of anti-infantry flamers is not good news for the Dark Elves. So I was playing against Jono, lovely guy, and we were drawn on Purge the Foe for mission 1, which is the Kill More, Hold More mission, and we were on Crucible deployment, and I got the first turn. This was on the player place terrain. We went with the setup that was pre-described. We didn't want to do player place. I personally felt from a sporting standpoint, I had a lot more guns than Jono overall, although the Deathguard shoot, I've got more guns. I didn't really want to put him in a player place situation where the logical thing to do was create a wasteland, which just didn't feel very fun for anyone. In terms of a game plan with Deathguard, it's something where you have to lean into the speed. Now, when I played them before, I went for a full aggressive block in order to try and pin them in their deployment and shore up the scoring. Now, on Purge the Foe, this simply isn't necessary, right? Purge is about getting kills first and foremost. The hold more very rarely happens, especially in the early stages of a game. So all of the primary scoring is sort of concentrated in your ability to outkill the opponent. So with that in mind, I'd loaded one flank very heavily, and it was the opposite flank to where the 10 brick of Plague Marines and Rhinos were going. And my general plan here can be described as avoidance / defanging, right? When you've got a very dangerous counter-combat army like Deathguard, the key thing is to play like a big old coward, cripple them at a distance first, pick off their assets, pick off their utility, play around anything you simply can't engage with, in this case the Foul Blight spawn brick, because there's not a win condition there until you're able to get guns into it and soften it up drastically. So Standing off, using our superior guns and playing at range was key here, and by swinging to a side and pushing one sort of safer side early, that creates a situation where you're going to be able to jump out and get angles into Blade Burst crawlers, because obviously Deathguard output, especially passively, depends on the shelling coming from the Blade Burst crawler. On a mission like Purge, it's how Jono is going to pick up my scoring, it's how he's going to kill my units, and without me engaging him. And so I need to be able to get angles on and start dropping those. If I can kill one or two of them, the Deathguard output completely collapses, and then I'm in a really nice spot as far as the mission goes. I have to make things happen because I'm on first turn, cannot afford to be waiting around and waiting for the end game swing and waiting for out killing him passively. So I do push things, but I push things in a cowardly, sneaky fashion and stand off him while shooting him as much as I'm able to, getting every angle I can with Scourge. I sacrifice the Haywire Scourge early, fire and fading onto a far point to draw other assets of his out. This ensures that I can actually shoot them at a vehicle before they get shelled, because I've pushed them out extremely far. And it also ensures that Jono then sends other units out to go and counter them and remove them from the point, which I'm then able to keep generating my kills from. So I'm using my assets to draw Jono out, using things like the racks in the middle to, again, pull assets forward to deal with them and then counterattack in response. And I'm able to get the kill more for a couple of the first turns by using my shooting and avoiding giving Jono too much to hurt. The Plaguebird crawlers do what they usually do, which is begin to kill Scourge, but do so at a relatively slow rate. Now, this matchup's very different when the Deathguard have Mortarion, because they can ignore all the modifiers and then they can start demeching you and killing your stuff much more aggressively. But in this case, they were whittling away at Scourge squads at a rate I could mitigate. And then obviously your job in an artillery situation is to give the artillery using opponent very real problems that they then want to use their artillery to answer. You don't want them in a situation where they're like, well, I can just pick off the Scourge and not worry about the other stuff. So by pushing up on one side, throwing chaff out onto points, and just generally causing a nuisance, exposing the odd venom here and there to present kind of tempting potential targets for his longer range guns, which were the Blade Burst crawlers, I kind of managed to sort of distract Jono away from the task of killing Scourge after the first round or two. The fight first brick, I basically just avoid. It's still alive at the end. It runs one flank, I run another. If it had come to the middle, I'd have lit it up with splinter cannons, because Plague Marines don't like splinter cannons. And so I was fairly happy that I controlled this game relatively well. There were a couple of peaky moments in the early game, but Jono didn't quite get the luck to keep it close on the kills early, and that meant I was in control by the mid-game. So that ended in a 98-71 win to the Drukhari. Really lovely to meet and play Jono, so thanks very much for that, buddy. In round two, it keeps on being chaotic, and I'm drawn into the Chaos Knights, the spiky war dogs of death. And I'm playing Gary. Now, Gary is an old England hand from back in the day. He's played for Team England 40k, and it was clear playing him and talking to him. He's a very sharp mind and sharp player. And Gary is running lots of carnivores, lots of brigands, as is often the way with a single stalker character. But he spiced his list up a bit by bringing a few fun options as well that are a bit lesser seen. So he's got a Rampager, actually quite a cheap knight these days, the Rampager. Big, angry melee knight that he's given an advance and charge upgrade, I think. So once per game, that thing is going to run out of the wall in his back deployment, cover an unreasonable distance, and come to play. He also has some blue horrors for forward deploy. I really like them, but they are expensive. This is a data slate unit to watch. If blue horrors get even cheaper at any time, then as forward deploy options for demons and as a plugin for chaos, they make a lot of sense. And he also had the blue scribes, who do nasty AoE mortals that elves do not like, but are also an annoying lone op. Now, the mission really shapes this game. We are playing on UKTC, so relatively good shooting lanes, and neither army is really held up by it because the Chaos Knights can run through it and I can fly around it. But we're playing on Vital Ground. And Vital Ground is a very stodgy primary where the two objectives in the middle are worth a lot. Your opponent's backfield one is worth a lot. We've both parked an entire very dangerous army in our deployments. Neither of us is pushing through to the backfield anytime soon because we can both screen relatively well. So it all becomes about how we manage the center. And in this game, I think I have a slightly better grasp of the win conditions on the mission than Gary does. I get first turn. I've set myself up in this instance so that I can put an enormous amount of stuff on my safer objective on my side. Like, really stash it up. There's a lot of OC2, there's Cabalites, there's racks, there's the entire beast pack which I park. I'm not using it as a forward pressure piece here because Chaos Knights can just run through it anyway. And this means that objective, from a Chaos Knights perspective, isn't gettable by just sending one Chaos Knight through a wall to deny primary, which is something Chaos Knight lists love to do, right? Just send the one War Dog through, put OC8 on a point, take it off me. I have made it impossible for Gary to do that. And Gary, I think, for his part, either he has the big knight deployed on that side, hiding behind his safe building, which means there was less room for other war dogs to be there, which means the war dogs are kind of spread out all across the deployment. It's not actually that easy for Gary to kind of adjust and throw everything that way, because he's going to be walking across the middle and walking in view of my Dark Lances and Haywire, which obviously not nothing into Chaos Knights. I've got very good guns for killing armagers, and if he gets close, I've got very good Incubi for killing armagers as well. The 10 brick is just hiding and waiting for the big knight to emerge, because those two have a date with destiny, right? I'm holding it, I'm waiting. As soon as Gary commits the big knight, that's where the 10 Incubi brick will go. So in that sense, my game plan is defensive and reactive. I stage a few things up so I'm able to trouble deny primary on Gary's objective on his side in the early game, and I try to avoid committing too much. I need to keep my assets, because with Gary on the end of turn, there is a sort of danger scenario here where he pushes in the mid board in the mid game, breaks through, is then able to get armagers onto my home field towards the end and score a huge turn of primary, the kind of which I simply will not be able to score going first on my own steam, running into the wall of knights. So I hold off, I keep scoring and keep chipping away. I always take tactical, incidentally, into Chaos Knights. Fixed is tempting, but guys, Drukhari can score more than fixed secondaries tend to allow, right? Drukhari can hit that 37, 38, 39, 40 secondaries. If you take homers and you bring it down into Chaos Knights, you're often settling for 35. And I think we can do better. So try to do better. Eventually in this game, Gary kind of realizes the way the pattern's playing out. I've denied his primary on his side a couple of times, throwing units out that way. I've managed to drop a couple of the war dogs that are walking around in the midboard, sort of scrapping. His artillery has done what it usually does. Chaos Knight artillery is slightly less dangerous than Deathguard, which means that unless my Scourge decide to roll purely 1s and 2s for their saves, it actually takes him 3 or 4 turns to really damage the Scourge with his no line of sight shooting. So in this instance, Gary realizes in the mid game it's time to push, and he pushes up with the Rampager. That runs through on that flank. He pushes up with the Carnivores as well. And again, I've managed to put enough rubbish in the way that he can't swing the points, crucially. He does manage to deny on my backfield objective at one stage, but I'm a little bit more relaxed about this because it's only 2 points to me in the grand scheme of things. And as long as he doesn't hold it, that's the crucial thing. The Rampager eats the 10 brick of Incubi, which is obviously great for me. That's a nice situation. But there are a few peaky moments as pain tokens start to run low, and I start to bounce occasionally. Dark Lance is bouncing off the last few nights, and it's very peaky as to whether I'm going to be able to hold Gary's push and stop him having one breakthrough turn, which will be very big on the primary. As it is, we just about grind it out. The last couple of war dogs fall down, which means that Gary's left with his sort of backfield, home field protection. Doesn't have anything to push in the final turn, which secures me a 74-60 win. Really good game, lovely opponent, really enjoyed it. Next up, I am drawn into one of the veterans of the 40k scene. It is Mark Pilkington, someone I've played on several occasions. First time when I was quite new and first playing Drukhari, and again more recently in the sort of GSC and CSM era of late 9th. Now, Mark's a very canny player, and the last couple of times I hadn't really felt like I was in a game. I felt like Mark controlled the game completely. So my goal this time was to make it a bit harder for him. And I think I'd say I did that. I think it was a very interesting and tough match. Mark is running Crypt. Of the Necron flavors, this is the one I would... Crypt brings the Monolith, it brings Immortals and Warriors, it's got a nice mix of Destroyers, and it's got Wraiths. And Mark doesn't run Catan in this list, which is something that I think a lot of the better Necron players do. They're a bit easily tied up and played around. Now, Crypt has some actual weaknesses as far as Drukhari go, because we can kill a Monolith. We're very good at blitzing a big target, and Haywire is great at damaging them. And we have the speed and width of assets to gum up and tie up their units, which makes their sort of jump up, jump down plays a lot more difficult. I've beaten Crypt in the past, but I think I had the player advantage in that situation. But I was definitely conscious this was a game that I had some tools for and some tricks for. Now, the mission's Scorched Earth. That means quite a grindy primary. And I was on second turn. In this instance, this was a bad thing, because as we had deployed, Mark had realized in deployment, it was actually very hard for him to deploy his assets. Again, we're on UKTC for this one. It was difficult for him to deploy his assets in a way that he could protect everything he'd put on the board from Dark Lances, and he could protect everything he put on the board from a first turn Beast Pack charge to tie things up and start controlling which of Mark's assets he could jump up and jump down. As it is, he got first turn. He uses a relocation to the monolith to adjust his positioning and put a big screen of warriors in front of it, so I can't tag it with the beast pack, which is very canny of him. And he starts moving up. I then move up fairly passively as well. There's a decision to take on the right side as to whether I go for the Wraith Brick. He's exposed it enough that I could hit it with Lilith and my 10 Incubi Brick if I wanted. These are the two units that in tandem can go through a Wraith Brick. But in this instance, I think I was sort of planning to counterattack. As I say, the game plan here is very much let Hypercrypt start doing its thing, then spring, kill the monolith, tag everything. That's how you win the game. But in this instance, I decided not to force the issue on that side, which I think probably allowed Mark too much freedom to decide how to bring his assets down. He doesn't manage to get destroyers into anything too serious in the second turn, but he does manage to find a flank point with the monolith to jump down, start getting some mortals in, start culling some of my units, and sort of popping things like the Beast Pack and some of the MSU on that side. So the counterattack is then sprung. I use Haywire, Grenade, and Incubi Squad, and that kills the monolith. And I push on the other side, going into the Wraith Brick with Lilith and my 10 Incubi Brick. And we kill the Wraith Brick, which is great. So on that flank, we've broken through. But unfortunately, as we're killing the monolith explodes. And it does something in the region of 22 mortal wounds to gathered Drukhari MSU, which is obviously a bit of a disaster for me, and means that my pushback on the left flank suddenly collapses. Right, I've got a situation where I have melee units ready to jump back into Venoms, which will then force Mark's shooting units to engage me, and only be able to necessarily demech me unless he can get good angles, and sort of start to play my game a little bit on that side. But the explosion wipes out my Incubi on that side, wipes out some Kabalites and some Racks and a bunch of other things I'm using to kind of contest that flank and try and hold Mark up on the primary. So we've been going level. I've been denying primary, throwing assets into the middle and on the flank. And I have managed to break through on one side, destroying the Wraiths. But then the collapse on my left-hand side means that Mark is then able to commit more of his teleporting units, more Immortals, Warriors, and Destroyers, and also Serras, Illuminor Serras running down the middle, proving completely unkillable, but actually rolling terribly and struggling to kill MSU Eldar at the same time. He's able to do that to sort of gradually roll down the middle, push me back into my sort of home field and prevent me from getting a sort of an edge on the primary. We actually end up very close. I think we draw 30 all on primary. I'm able to swing back right at the end, but not enough on the Scorched Earth scoring. And crucially, the Hypercrypt have just scored the secondaries way better than me. I've been on the defensive for so long. Marcus controls space on the board so well, stopped me getting in on several locations. I do break through on one flank, but it's not enough. And the cards have lined up that the Hypercrypt have soundly triumphed 80-65 on the secondaries. Now, for me personally, the progress here was just that I could see I had Mark worried at times. I think Mark played it very well. He's an exceptional player, but it was really good to see I had a game plan and a setup and an approach to this matchup that meant he definitely had to work hard and think. And I think in our last couple of games, especially when I was still finding my feet, competitively, I think it was clear that he was always very firmly in control of the matchup. So that's a personal badge of progress, and well done always. Mark's a delight to play. We had a really fun game. I was a little bit sad when the monolith exploded. I love an explosion, but this was like, oh no, my heart, my counterattacks collapsed. But it was, fantastic cinematic moment. You know, Haywire and Incubi going into this big pyramid that then detonates and takes all the Dark Elves with it. Absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much, Mark, for the game. Absolute pleasure as always. So we have the evening off. I rest up. I don't get too sort of out of my tree in the evening in the celebrations with my 6++ teammates, and just kind of get some rest and focus on the next day. And in this instance, I'm drawn into Craig, who's playing Chaos Knights, and Craig's a friend and supporter of the show, and he knows our very own Ed Fawcett. So I know Craig through conversations, and he's a really lovely man, and I've got a lot of time for him. We've had great conversations at events before, but we'd never played. Now, Craig is running a more standard sort of War Dog spam version of Chaos Knights with some Nurglings and then a cheeky Beast of Nurgle for holding his backfield. And the mission this time is priority targets. It's on a Games Workshop style board that has much more substantial midfield ruins that block off a lot of the angles and make engagement over the center a lot harder. Crucially, there's also hidden supplies, which means there's 6 objectives for scrapping over. On priority targets, this doesn't mean much in the early game because it's only hold 1, hold 2, but it means a hell of a lot in the late game because it means whoever's going second has an awful lot of opportunities for swinging a 15, and also crucially above all else, getting onto points for the end game additional primary and denying their opponent the additional primary. So I get the first turn in this, which means it's on me to be aggressive, once again, as with the Chaos Knights matchup in Vital Ground. But because I don't have to deal with a huge rampager, because the primary itself has more objectives and is more generous, I can be more proactive and disruptive in this game. I don't need to hold off and just what we have, we hold. I can create opportunities for holding primary simply by being a massive pest in the right parts of the board, specifically hitting Craig in his sort of southern, ostensibly safer part of the board, making the game about fighting over that in the middle, and basically distracting attention away from my soft parts in the backfield and screening that with all the chaff that I now have. So this was a game where I pushed out, again, kept knocking armigers off of the flanks. The 10 brick of Incubi goes in at one stage and kills 2 carnivores at once, which is chef's kiss, really enjoyable time. And Dark Lancers and Haywire were able to eventually sort of pop out and find angles. The Ravager really struggled to get angles on this map. It's a running theme of the event that the Ravager was quite board dependent. It works on UKTC, but I struggled to get good beads with it on a couple of the maps, and that does put its place in the lineup in question. I think in the main, again, taking tactical worked out way better because, again, we hit the 100 score here. You simply don't do it if you take fixed. And I had more CP to play with for all the wonderful tricks that Sky Splinter has. And so I whittled away the Knights at a fairly healthy rate, 2 or 3 a turn. I think 1 turn maybe I got 4, which meant that just by the end, I'd put Craig in a position where for the end game scoring, my 15 was secure. And Craig was scrapping to get his, having been put on 5s for a lot of the game. So that was the pattern of the game, really. I think its first turn is obviously big in terms of who gets to stage. And I think potentially on this board, if a lot of Chaos Knights come through the middle very aggressively in the mid game, it might have been very difficult for me to actually deal with and repel them all at once. As it was, controlled the terms of engagement fairly happily, and I think it's probably time now we can say Chaos Knights is a reasonably good matchup for Drukhari. I've had fairly comfortable games with it so far. Once again, the artillery popping off a scourge or 2, but not really doing enough to put me on a timer, which is what obviously the better artillery really does. So, round 5, we hit our final game. You always have your fingers crossed here for a matchup to get you home, something you can manage. Unfortunately for me, I was drawn into, I think, possibly the worst matchup for Sky Splinter Assault at this moment in time. If you have a better one, do let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And that is Necrons Canoptech Court. This is piloted by Paul, and Paul has gone for a sort of Josh Roberts style Canoptech Court, which takes no Catan in favor of just having tons of stuff. So Paul has 18 Wraiths, 3 big bricks. He has Doomstalkers, he has Tomb Blades and Destroyers, lots of little utility units, a couple of Deathmark squads for teleporting in and shooting. And the mission we're drawn on is on a sort of WTC type board, which was Necron themed. Boo, don't like that. But really cool board. Quite hard to get good shooting angles and lanes on, but good staging for combat, which suited both of us. We're both playing armies that quite enjoy having shooting controlled and good amounts of combat encouraged. Search and destroy deployment, and a take and hold mission. Now, the issue for me with take and hold primary is that it's very generous, and Necrons love primary. So the Necrons in this instance are going to race into an early primary lead. The pattern of the game typically with the Canoptech Court is that you are going to have to launch a counterattack. You need to lure some of the forces forward and then be able to counterattack in such a way as to pick up Doomstalkers and pick up ideally 2 of the Wraith bricks in decent time. If you're able to do that, that can create enough space on the board for you to push and make a breakthrough. So I was fairly happy in the game plan. I was aware of the limitation here, which is that typically I can kill 1 Wraith brick. I've got the tools for that. Killing multiples when in the heat of battle is much, much harder, and that's where my issues arise. Paul, for his part, is patient. He plays it very sensibly. He doesn't come straight at me. He doesn't waste his forward deploying Wraith Brick. He doesn't wait around to see what kind of damage I can do, which is something that I find a lot of more inexperienced Necron players do into Drukhari. I think their assumption is, well, you're not going to hurt me, so here I come. And if you're given enough ins, you can do serious damage. So Paul focuses solely on scoring and makes a much slower advance, sets up really good Overwatch lanes with his Doomstalkers, which makes my life in the middle very difficult. Venoms will just die to a Doomstalker Overwatch, as will, entire Drukhari 5-man. So once those things are in position, it's very difficult to operate in the midboard with impunity. So I was always having to bait out Overwatch, and once I could do that, things freed up, but it was much harder work. And in terms of the primary pattern, I think my kind of assumption was that there was probably going to be a turn where I got a 5 on the primary, and then I was going to have to push to lock in 10s and push for a 15 towards the end. Unfortunately, in this game, a couple of different things happened. Paul's cards in the early rounds were very good, which meant he was scoring very handsomely. I didn't draw cards I could realistically do for the first 2 turns. There was area denial possibility at the start, but my concern, not really knowing how Paul was approaching it, was that anything I put in the middle for area denial might be used to slingshot the entire Canoptic Core army towards my backfield. And I'm trying to protect that and trying to protect my primary, so I didn't want to take it. With hindsight, I probably could have flung a 5-man of Kabalites out. As it is, I killed some stuff in the middle with my Incubi and then moved back into a transport. This was a misplay. I was quite tired end of round 5, and I did make a couple of misplays. I lost the 5 Incubi and the Venom 2 cheaply, because Paul was then able to counter and open them up with Deep Strikers and Wraiths and kill the contents, which is a big loss for me. And so that meant I'd lost one of my good melee outputs for the counterattack. Paul then pushes on the flank that I'm expecting him to push on. I managed to avoid a primary loss, I think, or maybe I lose it for 1 round. I think I possibly lose it for 1 round. And then I do what I would typically do. Lilith goes in, kills a Technomancer, 10 Incubi Brick goes in and kills the Wraith. I think in this instance, Paul rolls hot. One of the Wraiths does survive, but I'm able to finish it off in the next round. The issue I have by this point is that Paul has played a very good expansive game. He's kept dropping utility into all the little pockets I might want to push forwards from, so he's blocking me off, stopping me from getting out and threatening his backfield. My own reserves are being forced to come in the back, which is often how it goes. If you're on the second turn, you often end up being locked in this position. And this is very much something I was doing to other people with my stuff earlier in the event. So fair play to Paul. It was good to see it being done to me. And that meant that, again, as my secondaries continue to be a bit ill-timed and ropey, it was really hard to get a score foothold in the game. And my primary continued to evaporate when Paul makes a longer charge. My other mistake in this game is using my reactive move on the Raider, because I'm trying to set it up to make a push for Paul's backfield objective. But I should have saved it, because he then lines up an 8 charge on a Venom, which gets his Wraiths onto my backfield objective. And at that point, I've got massive problems, because I'm not getting 10s on primary that I'd managed to carve out initially. And I think that's where the CP usage was wrong for me, and I needed to save it for that situation. So Paul springs a kind of more aggressive play in the mid game, which is a really nice change of pace, very adapting to the circumstances really effectively. I don't ever quite manage to break through to the back objective. I get frustrated and held up. My deep striking efforts don't quite work. Some Mandrakes attempt Hail Marys, they don't quite manage it either, which means I fall short. I've had a bad game on the card, so I fall short on the secondaries, and I fall short on the primary as well. So it's a decisive 161 win to the Necrons, who've scored brilliantly, and all fair play to Paul. He piloted the Canoptic Core incredibly well. I think when it's piloted patiently, waiting for its go turn, just using it as a control army, because that's what it really is, it's an incredibly dangerous force and a really tough one for Drukhari. If any of you out there have successfully beaten Canoptic Core on a regular basis, let me know in the comments. I want to know. I want to beat that thing. I haven't done it yet. So, as far as the event goes, I think I finished 18th out of 52 with a 3-2. And I think realistically going in, looking at the missions and matchups I had, that would be completely fair. I was pretty much getting the outcomes anticipated going into matchups. There weren't surprises. I think the only one was the Hypercrypt was like a maybe. It felt like there was a game there that I didn't quite manage to capitalize on. But otherwise, I think pretty much going as anticipated, which for me at this point in thinking with ahead to ITT means I'm fairly happy in my projection of outcomes and scores, and that was really nice to see. Was very happy with 18th, and several of our other 6+ boys podiumed, not podium, but finishing the top 10 above me. Well done, Alex, and well done, Connor. So really chuffed to see some of the other lads doing well as well. As far as my assessment of the list, I think Mixed Arms gave me more control in games, especially ones where I had a sort of list advantage. It meant my scoring was very tight, my screening was very tight. Kabalites Fire and Fading was a more long-term passive way of doing damage than Incubi, who tend to commit and then die unless you are able to really control the engagements. It meant that this list didn't really have sort of a go turn in quite the same way. In turns where I really went with all the damage, I still was not completely putting an army away, which is what I felt like I could do with the other list. So that's the trade-off, really. You've got greater consistency, much less likely to have a big blowout, but probably not quite got the same spike damage potential in a big go turn that the triple incubi have. I definitely decided coming out of this that 3 Archons is still the way. Whether that's with a court or an Archon with Kabalites to give them reroll wounds, I still want access to the full rerolls to hit and wound on 3 units. So a third Archon will definitely be making its way back in. I've thought with that in mind that potentially the 10 Brick of Incubi, which remains an awesome tool to have, but also perhaps isn't necessary in enough of the matchups at the moment to justify, especially if certain kinds of units that require it go away, and we'll look to the data slate to see if that's the case. That being the case, you could move towards 3x5 Incubi, possibly even 3x5 Incubi and a Court of the Archon for a bunch of melee trading units alongside Lilith, potentially getting Drazar in as well. And the other things in here that I think were very terrain dependent were things like the Ravager, where the Ravager felt like it came off worst in shooting exchanges quite a lot of the time. It is useful. I've got endless play out of the Ravager in different ways, but it is at the end of the day a fragile gun tank that isn't cheap. And potentially, if you're going to 20 Kabalites, you don't need it as well. You've already got 10 Dark Lances that can fire and fade for a long time. Maybe the additional 3 that will often activate once and then get bodied, maybe that's not necessary. But we'll see. It's kept on surviving through each iteration of the list I've made so far. But I say, I'm enjoying the experimentation. It's reminding me what I like and what I don't like. And I think for teams, it's going to be a case of making a list which can score very consistently, but also does have the potential to do serious damage into particular kinds of skew out there in the game that Drukhari are very good at hurting, particularly marine bodies and tanks and those kinds of things. So that's all next on the shopping list, and I'll have to get to work now. But yeah, Hellstorm, amazing event, really enjoyed it, learned a lot as always, and got to play several great players, which is always the most important thing. Thank you so much for watching this far through the series. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely getting so many comments. I think talking about my favorite army and having a bunch of people feeding back and vibing with it and learning from it has been amazing. So yeah, thank you so much. For part 6, I think I'm likely to do a review of any changes and what they mean for Drukhari in the data slate, because my guess would be that I'm not going to be at an event before ITT, and I'm keen to make this stuff, and I'm keen to keep the Drukhari stuff coming. So I think once we have the slate, once we know what that means for Drukhari, I don't imagine it'll be that impactful, but there'll be some stuff to analyze, and I'll be back again to talk you through what that might mean for us out there in the competitive scene. Please do check out more Drukhari content and indeed more content in general on the 6++ YouTube. We had a bat rep go out this week with Tau versus Eldar. We've got another one with Harlequins versus Deathguard, where I'm playing Deathguard. Boo! Coming up quite soon as well. And remember that you can hit like, subscribe. Please do leave comments. Let us know what you think. It all helps the algorithm, helps us get our message out, and helps us get further in the game and the hobby as well. So thanks so much. And if you're really interested in supporting us, then you can become a 6++ YouTube member. Very small sort of voluntary contributions, which help, again, to fund our lovely team of content creators and keep our team going upwards in the 40k world. So yeah, please do consider that. If you're interested in learning to play Drukhari, you want to get some Drukhari coaching, you can also sign up as a chapter master on YouTube member, and I'd be more than happy to work with you. I absolutely love talking Drukhari, love teaching it, and I'd be happy to help you out. Finally, do get into the Discord. We have a big old thriving Discord. It's doing well. Tons of Drukhari chat going on in there. A lot of people talking about new mandrakes as those models arrive. And maybe actually I'll talk about new mandrakes in the next series as well. That would be really fun. I've got mine hopefully this week to get started with as well. So I really hope you're all enjoying Sky Splinter as much as I am. I'll see you all out there again soon. Bye-bye.